We will start with one of those macro trends that affects all countries, citizens, businesses, and of course, policymakers. And I'm very glad to present our first keynote speaker, who is a former Danish diplomat. He has spent more than 2 decades on the highest level of diplomacy and policy making, especially in defense policy in Denmark. Today, he is partner and head of Europe for Macro Advisory Partner, MAP, which is a consultancy helping companies and organizations navigate in this relatively difficult landscape. Thomas has also been head of Danish intelligence service for many years. He will explain to us why geopolitical fragmentation is here to stay. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Ahrenkiel.
Thank you very much for those kind words of welcome. I should say that whenever I give these speeches, normally it takes between an hour and a half. So today I have been given 15 minutes, and this must be a sign, I guess, of sort of Nordic-Baltic efficiency. We don't spend that much time discussing things when they are evident. But it also means that I will have to be rather brief, and perhaps also leave out some of the finer details, but I hope that you will bear over with me in that. So what I will do is to share some thoughts on the broader geopolitical trends as we see them at Macro Advisory Partners, and when we advise some of the largest corporates in the world, but also a lot of Scandinavian, Nordic companies, and of course broader European companies. So my key message here today is that geopolitical fragmentation is here to stay. We are moving from an era of globalization to a new era where politics, policies, and not least geopolitics will become more important for the economic business environment. When looking at the world today, it seems like a perfect storm. We have a major land war in Europe. We have geopolitical tensions, a climate crisis, inflation, high energy prices, and consequently we also have a cost of living crisis, and increased uncertainty about the global economic and recently also financial outlook. The broader story, however, is one of fragmentation. Flows of goods, services, I would even say capital, people, data, and ideas between different islands of the global economy are becoming politicized and even weaponized. We had an open bracket in history after the end of the Cold War. We saw a world that was focused on economic integration, on convergence, free markets, and a maximalist emphasis on efficiency. It was a very supportive environment for businesses and for asset prices in, I would say, a low inflation environment. That is now being replaced by a world that is fragmenting, that is interventionist, and with more volatile inflation. This regime change began with the financial crisis in 2008. It was followed with the geopolitical tensions with China, Brexit, COVID, and the ensuing supply chain crisis. But the open bracket really came to a symbolic end on the 24th of February last year with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But this invasion crystallized a broader set of trends, namely that we begin to prioritize resilience over efficiency. The need to build resilience is seen in the push for more defense spending, investments in energy security, in the form of fossil fuels as an alternative to Russian gas, but also in renewables to build climate resilience, and building geostrategic resilience in the company's operations and supply chains. The regime change means that we are increasingly paying insurance premiums to build resilience with higher costs, with more volatility and more inflation as a consequence. It is a more challenging environment for businesses. The nexus between the global economy and geopolitics is tightening, and more elements of commercial activity are becoming politicized. But while it is more difficult to maneuver, this development also holds opportunities for those that can navigate the new geopolitical realities. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on talking about what are the two main forces of geopolitical fragmentation as I see them. The first and foremost is, of course, the geostrategic rivalry between China and the United States. This rivalry has been intensifying over the last decade. As China has moved up the value chain, the US has grown increasingly concerned about the implications of China's rise. This concern was initially focused on the unbalanced and what they saw as unfair trade practices, but it has expanded to include Chinese control over important supply chains, including rare earths, raw materials. It has also portrayed into China's territorial assertiveness over Taiwan and the South China Sea, and not least China's ambition to become a global leader in new and innovative technologies. And as China has become more assertive on the global stage, the US, and also I would say the global West, is reacting. What began under President Trump has continued and indeed intensified under the administration of President Biden. Bipartisan support in Congress for a tough stance and a hard line against China is likely to continue and even intensify in the years to come. Initiatives such as US trade sanctions, export controls are likely to continue. We will see it on semiconductors, well, we have seen it on semiconductors, we have seen it on the forced labor legislation, and it will most likely be followed up in other areas, such as health, green technologies, and biotechnology. Indeed, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act can and should be seen in the context of the US seeking to reindustrialize in sectors of geostrategic importance. There are attempts to put guardrails around the relationship between the US and China. We saw it with the Biden-Xi meeting in Bali in November last year. However, even if there is a hope for managed competition and to put a floor under the relationship, this approach has not changed the underlying disagreements on each side, and each side is indeed continuing to strengthen their own position and criticizing the other. This may be characterized as guardrails for thee, but not for me. And with the intensified rivalry comes an increased risk of misunderstandings and events that could escalate into crisis, just as we saw it with the balloon incident earlier this year. At its core, this strategic rivalry is really about who is going to become the dominant economic, political, and military power in the 21st century, nothing less. And Taiwan is one of the key risks in this relationship. And while we do not consider a full-fledged invasion of Taiwan to be other than a tail risk scenario, we do see greater risk from increased Chinese coercion of Taiwan. It will likely be a process rather than an event, but it will have material impact across a wider range of sectors. The second force of fragmentation is, of course, Russia. Russia is challenging the Western-dominated global order, and in particular, the European security order. With the invasion of Ukraine, we saw the most obvious manifestation of this, but this is certainly not the only one. The war is unfortunately likely to drag on for the period to come. Russia is preparing its economy and its people for a long war, and is in fact betting that it can outlast not only Ukraine, but also the West. Ukraine on its side feel that now time is their enemy, and they are thus likely to try and gain decisive advantages in the months to come on the battlefield. The war is thus likely to culminate in the months to come, but none of us know when and where this conflict will end. whether in a stalemate, a frozen conflict such as we know it between North and South Korea, or with one or the other side making decisive gains and being able to impose a peace agreement on its terms in the period to come. One of the consequences, though, of the war is that the global West see Russia as a pariah. And this is not likely to change in the foreseeable future. There's simply no trust left in Putin and his regime. However, the war has not seriously affected the Chinese-Russian partnership, as illustrated by President Xi's visit to Moscow, I think, very recently. All the countries outside the global West are supporting Western sanctions or indeed policies towards Russia. And as such, the war in Ukraine is amplifying the divisions and the fragmentation that already existed before the war. So US-China strategic rivalry, Russia's war of aggression, they have further accelerated global fragmentation. And looking forward, it's quite difficult to see what could change this trajectory. For Europe and for the Nordic and Baltic region, this is bad news. Open economies, free market, stability of the global order have been key to Europe's success and integration. So far, the European Union has adopted a strategy of trying to balance between the US and China, while, in the words of Commission President von der Leyen, not being equidistant between the two. So where the US is seeking to decouple from China, the EU is trying to diversify, or as von der Leyen says, de-risk the relationship with China. A big question going forward, however, is whether Europe will align more with Washington in its rivalry with Beijing, while also trying to maintain economic ties with China to the extent possible. And as the US-China rivalry intensify, this balancing act will become increasingly difficult. Add to this the European dependence on the US security umbrella, which will become even more, or has become even more apparent with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In this difficult geopolitical context, Europe is seeking to become a geopolitical player in its own. As part of this transition, the EU has adopted a strategy of so-called open strategic autonomy. This means, in essence, three things. Firstly, a more assertive trade and not least industrial policy, limiting dependencies and vulnerabilities of supply chains, not least vis-à-vis China, but also trying to compete with the US industrial policy by introducing regulations such as the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, etc. Indeed, what we see is that green industrial policy has re-emerged as a tool of economic statecraft. The second thing that I would point to in the open strategic autonomy is a more assertive foreign policy of the European Union, such as the Global Gateway Initiative and other initiatives. And thirdly, we see a much more ambitious digital and data policy from the European Union. The European ambitions in this area also face, however, a risk of European fragmentation. So facing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European cohesion so far has been remarkable. It has gone beyond support for Ukraine and even included major achievements such as agreeing on an ambitious Fit for 55 package and Repower EU plan, trying to limit dependency on Russian gas and energy more broadly. But while I remain optimistic, there are also risks stemming from weak leadership in Europe. I think, as the saying goes, that we have two problems in Europe. One is a strong Franco-German leadership. The other one is a weak Franco-German leadership. And I think this is what we see, the last one, as of now. For companies and investors, and this is one of the final points, there are several implications of the new geopolitical landscape, and I will point to three. Firstly, it is becoming increasingly important for companies to understand and to navigate the new geopolitical landscape. Companies will have to manage the risks and opportunities stemming from geopolitical rivalry. They increasingly need to build their own resilience by conducting what we call geopolitical macro diligence, specific to their industry, their operations, their markets, and their portfolios. They will have to evaluate what geopolitical factors they are exposed to and prepare strategic options accordingly. This will enable companies to react quickly to a changing business environment. This is comparable to what we have seen with the whole ESG agenda over the last 5 to 10 years. But I would say that the new ESG is about energy, security, and geopolitics. Secondly, we are already witnessing a trend towards diversification of supply chains, not least out of China. Many companies are adopting China plus one strategies. They are nearshoring and even adopting a China for China strategy. This is being implemented in some of the world's biggest companies. But while these trends are real and they play out in the political circle and indeed in the boardrooms, if we look at the macro numbers, we don't really see it playing out yet. I do believe that this is likely to change moving forward. Thirdly, we often assist companies and investors in identifying different geopolitical scenarios. Scenarios that allows them to better understand how the world could develop and how they will be affected. The scenarios enable companies to design and to implement mitigating strategies and activities leading to better decisions. So going forward, we will probably see globalization being replaced with what I would frame as either sort of choppy globalization or even partial deglobalization, where the globalization that we have known continues in some sectors of the economy, while in other, and that is in the strategic sectors, however they are defined, fragmentation will be more prominent. But there will also be other darker scenarios in which globalization will be replaced by competition, rivalry, and even conflict, where we move towards perhaps what I would phrase a Cold War scenario with two blocks forming, or a scenario in which different geopolitical archipelagos develop more or less independently from each other. So to conclude, navigating this fragmented world is a major challenge for companies and for investors. For those that succeed, however, it also presents significant opportunities. And I will conclude by highlighting 3 such opportunities. First, as the EU seeks to balance between the US and China, European companies may benefit from China's reopening as foreign but not American investors. Secondly, the influx of government incentives in priority areas such as high-tech manufacturing, clean energy, supply chain resilience, that will reshape the business fundamentals across many sectors. And finally, the energy transition will transform the global commodities landscape with commercial opportunities in new geographies, rich in critical minerals, and indeed in renewables potential. So with that, thank you for your attention.